Number 133 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all your comments through the chair. Our first panel today for 4:30 to 5:30, we're studying Supplementary Estimates B 2024-25. Votes 1B, 5B and 10B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have with us on our first panel, of course, the Honourable Diane Laboutier, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard. Joining us as well, we have Annette Gibbons, Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and Mario Pelletier, Commissioner of the Canadian Coast Guard. Welcome, Minister and officials, and thank you for appearing today. Minister, you have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am delighted to be here today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people to present the 2024-2025 Supplementary Estimates B on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard. Before I begin my remarks on the supplementary estimates, I would like to inform the committee of a matter of interest to some of you. I am pleased to inform you that the Government of Canada has approved a new set of regulations for the Elver fishery, and that these new regulations will be published in the Canada Gazette on December 18th. These new regulations will create possession permits, export permits, and traceability solutions that will help manage this fishery into the future. While I await the final advice and recommendations of my officials, I am more confident than ever that the 2025 Elver fishery will proceed as promised. Now, in these supplementary estimates, I am requesting $531.1 million, and this includes $524.7 million in approved appropriations and $6.4 million in statutory appropriations. With regard to the approved appropriations, the bulk of this funding will be distributed among the following four sectors: funding for the Great Bear Sea Project Finance for Permanence, funding to advance reconciliation on Indigenous fishing rights, funding for small craft harbours, and funding for the Coast Guard, including funding for fuel and fleet renewal. I'd like to take the time to highlight these last 2 points for this committee and their importance to our communities. As Federal Minister of Fisheries, small craft harbours are one of my top priorities. This essential coastal infrastructure supports Canada's thriving fish and seafood sector, which employed 45,000 people in 2022. With a federal inventory of nearly 950 small craft harbours, it takes a great deal of time, effort, and money to keep them in good working order. This has become even more difficult in the face of extreme weather events. The funds that I am requesting today will be used to repair and maintain small craft harbours, including those damaged by Hurricane Fiona, through initial investments in climate-resilient infrastructure. I'd like to take a minute now to highlight several ridings that are receiving funding for small craft harbours in the estimates. Miramichi-Grand Lake, currently represented by MP Jake Stewart, will receive approximately $1.63 million for the harbours at McEachern's Point and Point Sapin. West Nova, represented by Chris D'Entremont, will receive money for the Port of Medigan. Cumberland Colchester, represented by Stephen Ellis, for projects including the Port of Wallace. These are just a couple of examples among many that include other ridings such as Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman, Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, Bruce, Grey, Owen Sound, Perry Sound, Muskoka, York Simcoe, and Chatham, Kent, Leamington. Small craft harbours are at the heart of many coastal and Aboriginal communities by ensuring that they are safe, accessible, well-maintained, and built to withstand the effects of climate change. We'll be contributing to the long-term economic prosperity of the fish and seafood sector and the communities that depend on it. The continued games of the Conservative Party and others in the House of Commons are jeopardizing funding for projects in their own ridings. And so I strongly encourage the Conservative Party and others to stop jeopardizing important projects in their own ridings. And if they do, they should be prepared to answer to their constituents as to why their harbours will have to go without maintenance, dredging, and other important activities. This brings me to my next point concerning funding for the Canadian Coast Guard in the supplementary estimates. For supplementary estimates B, the Canadian Coast Guard and DFO are requesting $29 million to recapitalize the Canadian Coast Guard's fleet of small vessels, $28.1 million for operational requirements of the future Canadian Coast Guard fleet, $20 million for marine fuel. I would venture to guess that every one of us here understands the importance of the Coast Guard. Many of us have witnessed firsthand their bravery and importance to our communities. And so it is disappointing that the work of renewing the Coast Guard fleet is now in jeopardy if the Conservative Party and others continue to threaten to not allow the estimates to pass in the House of Commons. And it's even more disturbing that the leader of the opposition and his MPs are holding hostage the fuel money that is needed for DFO operations. And so I'd like to end my remarks today by calling on the Conservative Party and the other parties to get out of the way, let the government do its job, and not let political anger put coastal communities at risk. And if altruism isn't reason enough, then I call on the Conservative Party and others to allow the supplementary estimates to pass, at least because their own ridings are supposed to benefit from funding through these estimates. I am now ready to answer your questions.
We'll now go to our first round of questioning for 6 minutes or less. Mr. Small, and I would ask members not to be interrupting when somebody else is speaking, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the Minister and officials for being here today. Minister, the FFAW, the MFU, the PEIFA, the UFCA, and many other fishing industry stakeholders are quite concerned about who's gaining stakeholder status at stock assessments. Do you believe that foreign countries should be able to influence decisions made at Canadian stock assessments?
Well, thank you for your question. And I would say that in terms of stock assessments, what we use is science. We know that climate change is disrupting the oceans, so we use science. We also use, we work at, the interpreter cannot hear when there are several voices.
Merci.
Well, my translation just failed.
Mine didn't.
Okay, so again, do you believe foreign countries should be able to influence stock assessments? Yes or no?
En ce qui concerne
With respect to stock assessments, as I said earlier, we don't work with foreign countries, we work with science. We work with people here, and we work with the provincial governments.
Merci.
If an ENGO receives large amounts of its funding from foreign sources, is it possible that they might push the agenda of their foreign funders?
Comme je l'ai mentionné,
As I said earlier, and I'll repeat it again, the decisions that are made by DFO are science-based. They're made by experts within fisheries and oceans and in coordination with associations and within the context of discussions with the provincial governments.
So I didn't get an answer there, but actual fishing industry stakeholders have reached out to me quite a bit lately. We've got two ENGOs right now that have gained stakeholder status in many, many stock assessments throughout Atlantic Canada. One of them has 5 out of its 9 major donors. That's Oceania, that are foreign entities. 16 out of 22 major donors for Oceans North are from foreign countries. Did you know this?
Écoutez, ce que je tiens à vous dire, puis
What I will say, and I'll repeat my answer again, when we are at the table making decisions, we work with our experts, we work with scientists, we work with associations, we work with the various representatives, government representatives in Canada, and we make the best decisions possible in order to ensure that our children and that our grandchildren will have access to fisheries in the future. That is my priority, and those are the priorities I will continue to work with.
So again, Minister, do you think that entities that are sitting around the table as stakeholders who receive the vast majority of their funding from foreign extreme activists, do you think that they should have the right to sit and have an impact on the livelihoods in our coastal communities?
je vais vous répéter pour la...
Well, for the 5th time, I will repeat my answer, and I think it's clear. We work with various partners sitting at the table with us, and we will make the best decisions possible in order to ensure that there will be food, safety, and security in Canada, and to ensure that our children and grandchildren have access to the fisheries in the future.
Minister, if we have ENGOs at stock assessments that constantly want quota cuts, fisheries shut down, fishing areas taken away from fish harvesters, and they're funded by groups from outside of Canada, why are you allowing that to happen? You are the minister. You have the final say. You have ministerial discretion. You know the industry is upset about this. Why are you not doing something about it?
Écoutez, ce que je tiens à vous dire, c'est que je suis ministre.
I am the Ministry of Fisheries, and I have been the minister for a little over a year, but that doesn't prevent me from taking a very clear position on, for example, the seal hunt. So I don't know how an organization could influence me. The work is being done, and the work will continue to be done.
To removing these ENGOs that are funded by foreign countries from stock assessments in Atlantic Canada. Will you commit to the fishing industry here today, yes or no?
J'ai pas eu le...
I'm afraid I didn't hear all the interpretation. Could the question be repeated?
Can you repeat that question, Mr. Small, please?
Ce sur
Yes,
quoi
okay,
je vais
Mr.
m'engager, je vais m'engager comme
I'll tell you what.
depuis que je suis ministre de la Pêche, à faire en sorte qu'on puisse avoir des pêches pour le futur, pour nos...
I'm going to make sure that we have a fishery for the future of our children and our grandchildren. That's what I commit to. And I'll be working with my provincial partners.
Thank you, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Minister, I noticed that about 40% of the additional funding that you're looking for is for something called the Great Bear Sea Project Finance for permanence. It's all about conservation, and it also says it's supporting sustainable economic development. Can you go into a little bit more detail on the sustainable economic development? Because sometimes when, especially fishers on the West Coast, hear conservation, they feel that their ability to fish and make a livelihood, difficult as it is now, would be further impaired. Could you give us some more background on that, please?
Oui. OK. Non, effectivement.
Well, yes, it's very important when you're taking into consideration climate change, and when you look at all those endangered species around the planet. So it's very important to have these marine zones and areas that allow these species to reproduce themselves. And ensure that we will have a future fishery. So this work is done in collaboration with Indigenous communities. It's a part of reconciliation. And we have other projects as well in order to ensure that we can support the reproduction of these species and support the fishery in the future.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Is the department, is the DFO subject to staff reductions as the federal government looks to trim the public service? Are you in a position of needing to oversee staff reductions at the DFO, and if so, in which areas?
Well, perhaps I can give the floor to the Deputy Minister.
We are looking at staff reductions as a result of the Budget 2023 reductions exercise. There's a lot of different buckets of money that will be making reductions in. Travel is one big one, so not staff reductions. Some of our procurement as well, our professional services budgets will be reducing. And then there will be other things that we're doing across the department in different areas, so trying to be more efficient in our use of different types of workers and categories. For example, more efficient in the way we do communications, more efficient in administrative services, financial management activities. So it really is broadly distributed across the department, and we expect that we will be able to do this in a way that does not affect services to Canadians. So that's a summary.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering if there's any consideration about rebalancing the DFO's resources. We quite often hear suggestions that the DFO is quite top-heavy at the headquarters in Ottawa, which is a long way away from our oceans. Is there any thought about getting more resources closer to sea level, where they can do things like enforcement, like a lot of the other things that the DFO is being challenged to do?
Oui. Mais...
So as it is, 80% of DFO's employees are distributed across the country outside of the National Capital Region. So, and we're very careful in the reductions exercises to not have an impact that is disproportionate on the region. So there's a higher percentage than the 20% of employees who are in the National Capital Region. There's a higher percentage than that of reductions to personnel in the National Capital Region. I believe it was 35 or 40%.
Oh, thank you for that. One of the other areas of concern, and it's come up with the Elver fishery and a number of other areas, has to do with enforcement. And I'm wondering if the DFO is considering making better use or more expanded use of Indigenous guardians to basically help fill in the gaps, because there's only so many peace officers or other officers that are available to enforce fishing regulations. And again, I'm thinking specifically of the Elver fishery, which was a pretty difficult situation for the last couple of seasons.
Je peux vous dire qu'on...
We work with Indigenous communities, and I'm glad you raised the guardians, because Indigenous communities really have an interest in working with DFO and working to ensure that these environments are protected and that the fishery is protected for the future. And so there are meetings with these communities in order to benefit from their knowledge and also to be able to benefit from fishers in general and science within DFO. So it really is in this way, by combining those three aspects and all the experience put together, that we will manage to protect the fishery today and be able to protect it into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Hurley. We'll now go to for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Minister. I saw many figures, many amounts in the estimates. So the Great Bear Sea Project, for example, I believe it's Great Bear Sea Project, is being given a considerable amount of funding. So I'd like to know, where do the coastal, Aboriginal, and Quebecois fishers figure into this? Earlier on, you said you want to make sure that our children and our grandchildren still have fish. So in terms of coastal communities, I mean, they are very concerned about succession. There were the offspring of fishers who were hoping to be able to do this. I'd like to know if anywhere in these millions of dollars there is money for this, for succession. Well, there are significant investments this year in small craft harbors in Quebec. There are permits that have become commercial permits, whether it has to do with sea cucumber permits or others. We've also had exploratory permits for lobster. So I think that Quebecers are benefiting from these investments. There are also protected marine areas. We're working with the Magdalen Islands, and we're also working with the government of Quebec around Anticosti. So could you give me sort of a ratio or a proportion? Could you tell us proportionately what Quebec is receiving compared to the rest of Canada? Well, what I can say is that this year, in terms of investments in Quebec, there's never been actually that amount of investment before in Quebec, if that's any reassurance to you. And I'm working very closely with the port authorities and as well as the fishers associations. Well, I would just like to recall the Orleans port and the Verchères port. These are people who are impatiently waiting for their ports to be renewed. Now, could you, well, recently we've heard Indigenous people saying that they don't have the means that they need to recover vessels, that they don't have what they need. So I'd like to know, within those 40,000 people working for DFO, are there any of them that communicate directly with these individual Aboriginal people? For example, they've been trying to recover these derelict vessels, and they have the skills, they have the knowledge, but they're imploring us, they're asking us, begging us to be listened to. Well, I can assure you that we work very closely with Indigenous communities. And I'm very proud of the work that has been done for derelict vessels. When you look at the work that was done, for example, in collaboration with DFO and Transports Department since 2017, 791 derelict vessels have been removed. So the work is ongoing. And I'm telling you this because I do work very closely with Indigenous communities. Well, good. That's great news. There is a fisheries crisis, and not later than Monday. The crisis, the fishery crisis, was being spoken about in Quebec, and the mental health of fishers who are suffering from DFO decisions. And that was being compared to a psychological trauma or shock that's almost as serious as the trauma that was suffered in Lac Mégantic. So that's a huge effect. And I'd like to know if within these estimates there will be any funding for other types of professionals, whether it be psychologists, sociologists, who are able to assess the psychosocial impact of decisions that are made before those decisions are made, and then that can help orient the decision-making. Well, first of all, I would say this. It's good that we both agree on the fact that there are many issues that the fisheries are facing, including the climate climate crisis, but to compare it to the Mégantic Lake crisis, I would say that that's not the case in the fishery. Oh, well, Minister, there are suicides happening. Well, there are going to be difficult experience within the Gulf, yes. And over the coming 10 to 15 years, there will be things we are going to have to work on, but we're working closely with associations, whether it be on the Atlantic side or the Quebec side. There is significant work being done, and there's collaborative work being done. I've had meetings with many, and over the past year, there really has been some momentum there for associations to work with the DFA. Well, there was a very constructive symposium recently, but that's not quite the message that we heard, and all the organizations were there. But that being said, I would just like to say that there is a considerable amount of money, but we're not necessarily seeing the results on the ground. And more funding is being requested.
Go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair, and bienvenue au ministre.
Welcome, Minister.
I recently had constituents in my riding from the Canadian Federation of University Women, the Nanaimo branch specifically, bring to me a series of petitions from constituents who are concerned about deep seabed mining. Minister, we know that the deep sea ecosystem, there's species that we have yet to even have a glimmer of understanding of. We know that the deep seabed regulates climate by sequestering carbon. We know that mining in our deep seabed would destroy sponges, corals, and other important marine life and habitat. We also heard in our most recent meeting from Susanna Fuller from Oceans North, who also talked about this issue. And Minister, I'm wondering if you could provide some clarity to both constituents in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, but also Canadians across the country who are concerned about deep seabed mining. We know that you made an announcement last summer that supported a moratorium on deep seabed mining, but we do have a Canadian registered, it's called the Metals Company, that recently announced they plan to submit an application to mine the international seabed on June 27th, 2025, which is rapidly approaching, even though there are no regulations in place to manage deep seabed mining. And I'm wondering if you will commit, and the Liberal government will commit, to putting these words into action to prevent this application from being approved.
Je vous dirais que le travail qui se...
What I would say is, first, before giving the floor to the Deputy Minister, is this. We need to be able to work, obviously, on economic development while protecting the environment, while protecting waterways, whether this be freshwater or otherwise. Freshwater also goes into the oceans. So this work has to be done. And there is collaborative work. We're sitting at the table in order to make sure that these environments are protected.
I appreciate the comment providing, but I'm wondering if you could answer the question specifically of whether the government will be approving this specific application for the company, the Metals Company, to mine the international seabed on June 27th. And I'd prefer this answer came from you, if possible.
Je vais te laisser.
Elle veut que vous répondiez.
Règlements robustes qui sont en place.
We have robust regulations, and we won't work outside the regulations. I'd like to ask the interpreters if they could please speak into the mics, because if they don't, I can't hear.
The problem is there aren't clear regulations on this. And so there is a lot of concern about moving forward on implementing mining in these seabeds. And so another question that's being asked as to whether you'll be implementing an international moratorium on deep seabed mining at the International Seabed Authority. People across Canada are asking for some clarity on this. We know that there's a lot of good work happening around the world, but here in Canada we need to make sure that we are a leader to make sure that this is not happening here.
So we are working in the context of the International Deep Seabed Authority, and the position of Canada has been clear that we will not approve deep seabed mining until there is a clear regulatory framework in place. And
Okay,
so that is.
thank you. Thank you. I want to move on to my next question, and I would appreciate any further clarification in written content so I could provide it to my constituents and to Canadians who are inquiring into this. Thank you. The other question is around the European green crabs that are invading BC waters. We're hearing from a lot of people who are very concerned about this. In particular, there's an article in the Narwhal that so well describes the impacts of the European green crabs, but I don't have time to be able to quote that, so I'm going to move on. But the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund is jointly funded by the province and federal government, and we know that companies that are doing essential work, such as the Coastal Restoration Society, we had Josh Charlson that was here recently. They've been doing this work for 4 years, and I have a quote. There was 780,000 crabs that were cleaned up just over a short period of time in these 3 Indigenous bodies of water. And so my concern is, though, Minister, is that despite the good work of organizations like Coastal Restoration Society, there's no more funding left. And so what's the plan to ensure that these invasive green crabs don't take over our marine ecosystems along the West Coast?
Okay. Puis écoutez,
I understand the concern. I also am concerned with respect to invasive species like the green crab that is found on the West Coast, but that is actually also on the East Coast. And we also know that marine traffic is increasing. So it's very important for us to continue to work together. I had an opportunity to communicate with the new Minister of Fisheries, and I want this work to continue. I'd like to give her time to become familiar with the issues so that we can speak about invasive species and other species.
Barron,
by the
thank you,
federal
Ms.
government.
Barron. Your time has gone over. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I must take exception to some of your opening remarks when you blamed Conservatives for slowing Parliament's work. I will correct the record. Parliament has been slowed because of your government's refusal to produce the documents for the Green Slush Fund. Will you tell the Prime Minister to release the documents? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Gars, écoutez, là,
Listen, I'm here today to talk about small craft harbors, including harbors in your own ridings, and I'm here also to talk about the Canadian Coast Guard. So I would strongly encourage you to stop these political games and work to protect our populations and our communities so that they can have the infrastructure that they need.
Sir, this committee unanimously voted to request your appearance for 2 hours for the review of the Fisheries Act. When will you be appearing for the Fisheries Act review?
pourquoi je comprends pas?
She doesn't know what Fishery Act is.
Vous tournez la tête, je vous
You don't know?
entends plus.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, just a point of order. Point of order. Clearly, there's a delay in translation. I think that all members should respect that. Let the minister hear the question, have it translated, and then respond. But jumping over is not helping the translators either.
Yeah. You got your hand up?
Well, it was on the same point of order, Mr. Chair. Like, even myself, sometimes I use a translation, and when some people thought we cannot hear the whole thing, so I guess I can imagine that a minister cannot hear the same either.
Okay, so is everything straight now?
Répondre de la bonne façon à vos questions.
I want to be able to answer your questions, so it's very important for me to be able to hear as well as possible.
Okay.
Before we resume time, with these translation devices, unless my microphone is turned off, I cannot hear the translation coming through. So we're going to have to make
well-
sure that we turn the microphone off when the minister is responding. That's why I couldn't hear the minister.
But you said you had to have your mic off.
I have to have my mic off.
Okay, so you'll hear the answer in your earpiece if your mic is off.
Yes,
Okay, that's easy
but
enough.
I
You
don't
can
think
turn off your
everyone
mic.
was aware of that.
No, you can turn off your mic on your own.
But the controllers are also controlling the mics.
I don't
So
know.
it gets-
I push on mine to
It
control
gets
the mic.
confusing.
Yeah, I push on this to control the mic, right here on the desk.
Could you tell me how much time was left?
3 minutes and 49 seconds, and we haven't started it yet.
Okay,
You ready?
when you're ready.
All right, go.
Thank you. Minister, can you tell us when you'll appear for the Fisheries Act?
Ben, je pense que
Well, there is work that has to be done on the Fisheries Act. I hope that the committee is doing its work, and I look forward to reading your recommendations. Now, at my end, I work with DFO and the associations in order to be able to make sure that our work is done.
An additional $500,000 to be added to the $5 billion already authorized to DFO for a total of $5.5 billion. Is that correct?
oui.
Yes.
Year 2014-15, DFO's expenditures were $1.7 billion. What you're proposing is a 300% increase over DFO's 2014-15 expenditures. Minister, would you say that DFO is doing 300% better service today than it was 9 years ago? Yes or no?
Là, vous me parlez de
You're asking me to compare a 2014-15 budget with 2024? Well, for your information, construction costs have risen, and the funding that's being requested today are for things like small craft harbors, including in your own ridings. It's for fuel for the Canadian Coast Guard. So I would expect us to rise above petty politics and make sure that our fishers are safe on the waters and that they also have access to the infrastructure they need in order to be able to do their work.
And increase. Would you say DFO is providing 300% better service than they were in 2015?
Ben, je peux vous dire qu'au niveau des ports pour
Well, what I can tell you in terms of small craft harbors and climate change, the fact that there's less ice, what that means is that dredging has become even more important. Costs have risen. So we have to do what we can to assist our fishers in being able to fish, to have access to safe infrastructure. They need that economic development, not just for the fishing, but also for the processing sector and for all the SMEs that are connected to the fisheries industry.
$1 billion of this, these estimates is in grants and contributions, which is basically paid to outsource operations outside of DFO. You're asking for $332 million in grants and contributions. Considering the $400 million that have yet to be accounted for in the Green Slush Fund scandal, can you understand why we want to know what this $332 million will be spent on? So could you provide us with details of what the $332 million in grants and contributions in the estimates will be spent on?
Ben, écoutez, je peux vous dire.
Well, I can tell you that there are new activities, there's fleet replacement, there are the protected marine areas, and as I mentioned, that we also need new infrastructure. There has to be new port infrastructure, and much of that infrastructure will be in your own ridings. So I do hope.
To ask for, we get this provided in writing to the committee, please, the details on the $332 million.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming. What you've heard so far from the official opposition is empty rhetoric, which consistently comes from opposition parties. As it relates to the management of the resource. And that's what occurred for years. And I'm now quoting and paraphrasing a former progressive conservative fishery minister called John Crosby, who had to shut down a fishery that totally collapsed. It is extremely important for your department to get a stock assessment accurate. And we do that well in a number of fisheries. And it was not always widely received and welcomed. But management is so important, and all the input we get on stock assessment is so important, because I only want to make decisions that ensure the future, successful future of fisheries. So, Madam Minister, I support the expenditures that you're looking for before the House, unlike the former Conservative government who slashed the small craft harbours funding for a number of years that left harbours deteriorated. So my question to you, Minister, on small craft harbours, I raised this with you before, is to look at the possibility of utilising your harbour authorities jointly to manage the output and repairs in harbours, who can get the job done in a lot of cases faster and more cost effectively. So, Madam Minister, would you ensure that that you will take upon yourself to see that the harbour authorities, the amount that they can use of federal funding to improve their harbours, is increased from what it is now?
Oui. Oui, je peux vous dire.
Yes, I can tell you that there was a meeting a short while ago with the various harbour authority associations. I attended virtually these meetings. They made their requests, and when I refer to collaborative work, that's also what I'm referring to. They have made requests. We are analyzing those requests, and in fact, the harbour authorities do very important work. And these are really volunteers who are doing the work. We need to encourage this work, and we need to do it in partnership.
Time to MP Cormier, Mr. Chair, for the rest of my time.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. Minister, thank you for being here today. Earlier on, you referred to the Conservatives. I absolutely agree with you. They vote against the initiatives that we're trying to bring up. They're blocking our fisheries initiatives. But the Bloc Québécois is also part of the picture. They came to Caraquette, Minister, a couple of weeks ago, and I really think it was a bit of a piece of theatre. Minister, they wanted to sort of make everyone believe that they were the fisheries saviors in Parliament. But there were more staff present there than actual stakeholders. However, the Bloc Québécois, just like the Conservatives, voted against the last federal budget. They voted against money for small craft harbours. And our colleagues asked earlier if there was a key in their riding. And what I want to know is, will some of that work be, for example, the work on wharfs, for example, will the work regarding the crab fishery and other work be prevented by this obstruction? Because the Bloc Québécois has sort of presented themselves as saviors. But if we don't have the money, we know what's going to happen. So tell us a little bit about the Bloc and what might happen if these supplementary estimates are not passed as quickly as possible. Well, what I would say is that in my meetings with associations and people on the ground, is that it is so important to invest in small craft harbours. We've been through Fiona. We will be experiencing other storms. Climate change is happening in the Gulf. And all these fishery associations, the fishers, they're all worried, they're concerned, and they want to work collaboratively. We've seen some of the work that has been done. There is work that was done in New Brunswick, where a pilot project was established for the striped bass. And what's important is that fishers work with DFO so that we can have the data we need, for example, and so that we can put this data together, and so that we can make sure that dead fish aren't going to be, for example, returned to the sea that may end up feeding the seals, as an example. And so I think there is plenty of evidence to show that we're working together, that that can work well, that this is collaborative work. And with respect to the Bloc well, the leader has already said that there was a fishery that was going to, that there was one type of fishery that was going to save their entire fishery. So I'll leave it at that.
Again now for 2.5 minutes or less, and I will remind members, don't be talking over when other people are in a conversation, whether it's the minister answering a question or whether it's somebody else asking it. The translation team have a hard time picking up whose voice they should be translating. So if you wouldn't mind, especially Mr. Perkins, he's been chirping all evening, but I'm going to forgive him for that for now. And Madame Debienne, the 2.5 minutes is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thanks.
Ami Serge qui est fâché contre moi, tu vis ça, toi? En tout cas,
my friend Serge is angry at me. Well, that's quite incredible. I just want to correct the record here. We voted on appropriations. We didn't vote for the budget. The budget was brought in by the government. And there was all kinds of interference in there in provincial jurisdiction. And that's why we didn't vote for it. So it's fine to sort of put these little candies in here and there and use it as bait. But it takes more than that to convince us. Now, in terms of your reaction, from what I understood earlier, you were saying you don't want to put a dead fish back in the water. You want us to work on the ground. You want us to work with fishers. Well, that's great news. We've been waiting for this. We've been putting pressure on DFO for years to get you to do that. We've been asking you to do this for years. We're so glad that you heard the message. Now, that being said, I'm just going to follow up on what was said earlier. I'm just going to follow up and take the bait here and continue, and I hope you all get the joke. What I would say is that there are new studies, new independent scientific studies that tell us this. There are many very interesting solutions out there that can lead to better integration between the work of DFO and the work on the ground. There have to be other actors involved, independent actors, independent scientists, so that we can rise above any politics. And this was raised at the symposium as well, and it was a very serious suggestion. So let's look at the future. You said you really want to work on the ground and to get input from the ground, and you want to have access to expertise on the ground, and that you want to really save the fishery for children and grandchildren. So when we're talking about environmental mediation, when we're talking, for example, about more independent groups that may have an influence on political decisions, well, when there are people who want less partisan involvement, is that something that you could consider? Well, what I would say is this. If you've just realized that we're out there on the ground, you're a bit late. I am very close to the ground and to associations.
Madame Debienne used more than her 2.5 minutes for the question itself, so there's not much time for an answer. So if you want to, you can provide that in writing to the committee at a later date. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's unlikely I'm going to take less. But
I'll be the one controlling that.
I want to thank the translators. I appreciate this has been a bit of a challenging meeting to translate. Minister, we have had an entire study here at our committee about the derelict and abandoned vessels that are lining our coasts. In Nanaimo, Ladysmith, and other coastal communities along Vancouver Island, we are particularly hard hit. In Nanaimo, in Ladysmith specifically along the coast, they have what's actually called the Dog's Patch, where there are vessels that are just all together, lying together, where they're sinking, they're polluting our marine ecosystems. It's a huge, huge problem and an issue that's being brought to my attention over and over again, not just for the environmental impacts, but the impacts on tourism, the safety implications to mariners. We have the information. We are in the process of putting forward recommendations from this committee. And my question to you, Minister, is will you commit to please help to clean up these vessels along our coasts and prevent them from, it shouldn't be easier for Canadians to abandon their vessel than it is to clean it up properly. And so can you commit today to work to see these recommendations implemented so that these vessels won't continue to line our coasts?
Bien, écoutez, des informations.
Based on the information I have, since 2016, 2,100 abandoned or derelict vessels have been reported, and 791 of those vessels have been withdrawn. So there are another 1,358 vessels in the inventory. And you are right to raise this. We're aware of the environmental impact of this, and there is work that has to continue.
So, Minister, sorry, phone's on. It's on. Can you commit to following through with the recommendations? I know you haven't seen them yet, so I'll tell you there's sound recommendations that have been put forward by witnesses that have come to our table who have told us the solutions that need to be put forward with. As a matter of fact, you could look at my bill. Everything that the witness says coincides with the bill that I put forward. Can you please commit to helping to clean up these vessels?
Écoutez, on va travailler pour faire.
We will commit to work within the budgets that we have.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We have approximately 6 minutes left, so I'm going to split it between Mr. Perkins and Mr. Cormier.
What, because of the technical delay? That's not fair.
That's what added the 2 minutes to it.
Minister, in the summer and before this committee, you insisted that you were doing enforcement in the Bay of Fundy against lobster poaching. Is that still true? Do you still stand by that?
Oui, les pêches.
Well, perhaps you could be a little more polite for the sake of the interpreters, please. Remember, I'm Francophone. You're Anglophone. You have to give me the time to be able to listen to the interpretation.
Your own department's documents show there was no enforcement day by day in July, August, and September. So did you lie to this committee, or are you just ill-informed about your department? 0 days of enforcement. Almost none. Only 4 days were there about 5 hours of enforcement on the Bay of Fundy in August. Why did you mislead this committee?
We are working very hard on illegal fishing, and we're working very hard to make sure that this continues. And the work actually began with fisheries associations. We also started working with the CRA.
1,000 lobster traps. How many were seized? $159. That is not enforcement. Now I'll move on. You're destroying the Elver fishery. Not one person has written to your department supporting what you're doing. Not the adult eel harvesters or any of the employees that you want to give this to. Your agenda, according to this, is to put license holders out of business. Another one says, why are you putting my family out of work with this communist policy? Why is it that you believe that people should make less money? What part of the Fisheries Act gives you the ability to decide what amount of money somebody should make, and what part of the Fisheries Act allows you to expropriate 75% of a business?
Well, in terms of the Elver fishery, there is work that has been done. There are stricter rules that have been established. And we're going to be able to allow families and young people to be able to earn their living. And
have you read the Fisheries Act?
And I care about the fishery.
it's impossible for me, and I'm probably sure for Ms. Koutrakis and Mr. Hardy, to hear anything about what's just being said. C'est impossible pour nous d'entendre.
It's impossible for us to hear what's happening. Interpreters cannot interpret when there is that much noise. So please, Chair, could you make sure there is order in the room?
I'm trying.
Que c'est dans la loi qu'au niveau de la décision
That's all
sur
right,
les
Madame Debian.
licences,
Madame
ça
Leboutier,
relève
the
de moi.
time is up for Mr. Perkins' questioning. I will now go to Mike Callaway to finish us off for the last 3 minutes.
Okay, can I begin? Okay, thank you. In the summer, Minister, we saw the Canadian Coast Guard conduct the search and rescue of 7 Newfoundland fishers off the coast of Newfoundland. The Coast Guard did phenomenal work, and it was because of their ability to act quickly and effectively that lives were saved, that families had hope and have their loved ones back, and in fact, the entire province was mesmerized by what was accomplished by those fishers, but in particular, also the Coast Guard. And with the obstruction going on in Parliament, I have a concern that the estimates are not going to be able to go through. So how does that impact safety for fishers in Newfoundland and Labrador, fishers in Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, Quebec, and elsewhere?
Ben, écoutez,
Well, in terms of what was requested in the supplementary estimates, we know full well that the cost of marine fuel has increased, that fuel is needed, and the money will be used in order to make sure that the boats can get out on the water. And perhaps I can give the floor to my colleague, Mario, Mr. Pelletier, to answer. Thank you. Yes, fuel is very important, as well as the equipment.
New technology, we need to do more training. So some of that money is going towards the Coast Guard College, and some of that money is there to start to recruit new people for when the new ships are going to be delivered.
Thank you. And in the same, I guess, same line of questioning in terms of if the supplements don't go through, how does that impact the small craft harbors in terms of repair and even dredging? How does that impact small craft harbors across Canada?
Well, the supplementary estimates do include the money from the budget for the small craft harbors. So there's all the Fiona repairs that we're doing in a number of different harbors. And just augmenting, we have a pretty, we do have a budget, an annual budget that we receive in our regular appropriation, but we do a lot more. We need to do a lot more on small craft harbors, and so we do depend on that supplemental money.
So I think I have 20 seconds left, Mr. Chairman.
17 now.
17 seconds. Thank you very much. I guess what's of concern to me beyond the party politics is that if we don't get things done here in terms of getting money to small craft harbors, but in particular safety, I believe that people's lives are at risk. And that's very serious business. So I hope we can get on with the order of getting the funding to them.
Thank you, Mr. Callaway. Your time is up. That concludes our first hour of questioning to the Minister. I understand the Minister is only here for an hour and the officials are staying for an hour to answer on the estimates. So again, thank you, Minister, for appearing again today. Always a pleasure. We'll suspend for a moment now to switch out. Suspend. introducing of the officials joining us on the panel, we have from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Richard Goodyear, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Financial Officer. And of course, we have Mario Pelletier staying and Miss Annette Gibbons staying. Mr. Burns is back again, and Niall O'Day is here as well. Welcome. I'm sure you're used to this by now. So you'll have an opening statement on the no, just go right into questioning. Okay. Look at that. Perfect. Okay, Mr. Small, for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're more than welcome, buddy.
And I'd like to welcome, yes, and our witnesses are more than welcome. Wonderful to be here. I guess to Ms. Gibbons, the minister just mentioned that around 113 million of her ask is to go into the Small Craft Harbours program. And she said it was a top priority. And she mentioned Miramichi Grand Lake was going to receive $1.6 million in funding, and she didn't mention my colleague Mr. Perkins riding here, South Shore St. Margaret's. How was that funding dispersed? What were the criteria for harbours to receive funding this past year?
So the, Mr. Chair, the process, the department sort of keeps a running list of the state of the different harbours. And then we look at a variety of factors. Certainly safety is top of mind. But of course, we have a lot of different harbours, of course, in across the country. And we really do look at commercial harbours that are important for commercial fisheries. And you know the number of users at a harbour, the importance of the fisheries in those communities.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gibbons. So of the 113 million that the minister's asking for right now for small craft harbours, how much of that is going to her own riding? Was I close to being accurate with the calculation of 45 million of the 113 to her own riding? Is that right?
I can't answer that question. We don't track by riding in the department.
Would you be able to provide that in writing to the committee, please?
We don't do that analysis by riding. That's not something that we do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's been identified that South Shore St. Margaret's riding alone needs $600 million to make it
by DFO.
To make it safe. And that's DFO's own numbers. And that riding received no money last year for its harbours and none this year. Was there an order that came out of your department to not fund small craft harbours in that part of Nova Scotia?
So
maybe Mr. Goodyear, you're the money man.
At the end of the day, it's a complex kind of weighing of different things. Sometimes a harbour is functional but needs a complete overhaul, like needs to be completely rebuilt. And so that is, I mean, something that is 600 million. It sort of sounds like it's in that category.
It's very odd to me, though, Ms. Gibbons, when you've got about a $2 billion lobster industry operating out of West Nova and South Shore St. Margaret's, that they get one project when it's close to 20% of our nation's GDP from the fishing industry, and they get one project. Can you tie that knot together for me?
There's a lot of different harbours. There's a lot of different needs, and
but you have to say that's awful peculiar.
Looks like an order.
So we do different things in different places depending on what the needs are. In some cases, we focus on just keeping things functional if it's a really expensive project to do and there isn't enough funding to do it. So there's just going to be a lot of different factors that go into that decision-making process.
There we go. I'll turn my time over to Mr. Perkins here.
45 seconds.
So your own department estimates Southwest Nova needs $600 million. It's the richest fishery in the country. It accounts for most of the value of our fishery. So the value of the fishery isn't there because no money is going in my riding and almost only one project in West Nova. The most dangerous fishery in the world, it's the winter. Yet Liberal ridings get it. The minister announced about $45 million in her own riding this past summer, and not a nickel into the most important part and community in the fishery with 7,000 commercial fishermen. Sure looks to me like somebody's made an effort to keep that most important conservative riding out of the picture, mainly because the minister doesn't like the way I question number 6. Is she giving an order to keep the money out?
The decisions on the final projects is something that I can't speak in detail to.
Does the minister approve the final projects?
The minister approve the projects.
Yeah, there you go. So the minister has clearly said that the part of the country that represents the most commercial value, as my colleague Mr. Small said, over 20% of the value of the Canadian fishery in that area gets nothing. And the minister has the final say. Looks to me like a political decision using taxpayer money, trying to save her own arse against Christina Michaud. And you're being used to do it as bureaucrats. To me, that's shameful. You should not allow the minister to make political decisions like that.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll now go to Mr. Kellaway for 6 minutes or less, please.
Well, okay. That was interesting. Maybe the worst episode of Matlock ever to try to put logic behind that, but I want to get to some questions with respect to, in particular, small craft harbors, but before that I want to go to CMP. So investments that we need to make in CMP, we need more and more CMP officers or more intel, more equipment to take on what is a difficult job for the CMP officers, which I have admiration for, whether they're working in South Shore St. Margaret's or in Cape Breton Island or all points in between. The world's gotten more dangerous for those men and women because of a lot of issues around underground sales, and a lot of other criminal activity. So I'm looking to see what are we doing to up our game in the CMP world with respect to providing resources and personnel and things of that nature.
So thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, there's an awful lot going on in the space of CMP. I think everyone is aware, this summer we had complaints by some of our officers in our Maritimes region in Nova Scotia and southwest New Brunswick about danger under the Canada Labour Code, and so that there's a multi-phased process that you go through in dealing with such complaints. And through that process, there was a decision by the investigators at Labour Canada on danger, particularly with respect to long-arm rifles and individuals who have sort of criminal involvement. And so as part of the multi-phases that we went through and the final ruling, we've been making a number of changes to the policies and procedures around our officers to make sure that they're safe, because that is our top priority, of course. We've done some very specific things on the safety front, even like equipment that they have. Hard body armor is something that we are moving to. We've started a pilot with an initial set of hard body armor for officers to wear in certain situations if that is warranted. We have body-worn cameras or another piece of equipment that we are working. They've been working with them for some time, but we're sort of moving that along and accelerating it and expanding the use. And of course, our policies and the sort of rules of engagement that they follow they never have to engage if they're in danger, and that is really, really important. But we have been going over those policies and procedures and making sure that everything is sort of up to the minute and reflective of the environment, the changes in the environment in which they're operating, making sure that their training is appropriate for the kinds of situations that they face, and making sure that the protocols around engagement of the RCMP, for example, and other law enforcement personnel is fully understood and invoked as needed.
Thank you very much. My phone just died, so how much time do I have left?
We have 2 minutes and 24 seconds.
I want to go to, the minister alluded to the new regulatory framework with respect to Elver. I'm wondering if there's anything that right now that you can kind of dive into in terms of what we should expect in terms of the new regulatory framework. And then I hopefully have a comment to make at the end of my time.
Framework is really intended to expand beyond the existing regulatory authorities, which are about harvesting elvers and possession by a fish harvester, to kind of moving along the supply chain to require licenses for those other points along the supply chain. So if you're going to be exporting elver all the way out to export, you will now need to have an export license as well. And so it's a very comprehensive approach to regulating in this sector that will just give us much greater visibility in real time on the elver that are harvested, and will allow us to just have a better knowledge of if there are elver that are sort of coming from another country and there's no export permit for them, that sort of thing. It'll give us a much better visibility into the whole market.
1 minute. Maybe I'll go to Commissioner Pelletier. With respect to the Coast Guard's role in working with CMP, can you kind of highlight of what we may be doing differently in the coming year that we're not doing now in terms of investments that you're looking for? Okay, sorry.
Obviously, some of the investment that we're receiving for new ships will support that, because having new ships will be more reliable, better technology as well too. But it's also about reporting when we see something from our ships that might not have a CNP officer on board, and we have a process there to make sure that we capture the information and it gets reported to the program. So if any actions have to be taken, it can be after.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Contrary to what our friends may think, the reason we ask questions is so that people's livelihoods and lot will be improved. And I'm sure that's the case for all colleagues around the table. So within that context, I'd like to ask you this. Who works in the DFO? There are bureaucrats, there are fisheries officers, Coast Guard, scientists. Is it only an issue of protecting the resource, or does anyone look at the outcome and the impact of decisions that are made by DFO? Does anyone assess the psychological impact, for example, in any of these coastal communities? Well, we do have, for example, economists. They look at the impact of the fishery, and they look at the value of what is being fished, and they also look at the losses within coastal communities. So you have economists, but do you have any sociologists, psychosociologists? Does that exist? I don't believe we have sociologists as such, but within the economist positions, that would also, say, include economy, statistics, sociology. Thank you. So you've asked for more funding, and could any of that funding be used to improve these kinds of studies? Because we hear that life is difficult. I'm telling you, circumstances are difficult. We did go to the Maritimes because we wanted to hear what people were saying. You know, Quebec is connected to the other maritime provinces through the Gulf, through the estuary, and we wanted to take the pulse of these communities and chat with each other. And that's why we were there recently. Ultimately, the idea was to understand these issues, and we wanted to understand the global picture, the overall picture. So do you think that it could be considered within DFO to not only manage the resource, but not to neglect that human factor and not to neglect the human impact? Because it's all very well to save a fish. I mean, people have come here and said, you know, that when you want to save one fish, you may end up destroying 3 families. So what I want to know is there any funding to measure that kind of impact that may occur? Well, as I said earlier, we do have individuals who do this kind of analysis within the department throughout the regions. We do have teams that conduct these analyses. Now, there are discussions that take place regarding the economic impacts of decisions, and these individuals give advice to the minister because the minister may take many factors into consideration, including socioeconomic factors. So we provide information to the minister regarding the socioeconomic impact of each fishery. So yes, there is scientific advice, but there's also socioeconomic advice. Well, sometimes decisions have been made that have had a severe impact, for example, on mackerel fishes. Let's take only as an example. And for years, the redfish has been a topic of discussion. Shrimp fishers are concerned, and I get the impression that that communication isn't happening. Something's happening on the ground, but the information isn't reaching anyone. Perhaps mediation would be a possibility. Could mediation, for example, be funded so that there's that better understanding of what is happening on the ground? Well, we do listen to fishers associations. Well, what we're hearing is that it's almost as if they're there as just, decoration. They don't feel that they actually have a substantive presence. Could there be any kind of mediation? Well, the department can't necessarily make a decision without advice from the communities. It's part of the obligation of the minister to take advice into consideration. And these kinds of discussions, this kind of analysis can take place, that is to say, regarding the socio-impact of various fisheries. So I think that's something that actually is integrated into the department. Well, if it is, then why are we hearing these kinds of things on the ground? That's what I'm trying to understand. Just trying to understand, basically, so that we can find solutions. Yes, of course. Why, then, are we hearing these kinds of things on the ground? What would explain that? Has something been missed within the communication? Is there anything that has been missed that could be reestablished? You know, I'm speaking in good faith because there's obviously something that's not getting through. And there are people who have done studies, and these are very serious people. They've done their masters. They've done their studies within universities, and they're showing that the shock and the trauma within the fisheries communities was almost as big as that of Megantic Lake.
Now we'll go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
And welcome back to our witnesses. Deputy Minister Gibbons, I'm assuming I'll put these questions to you, and then if somebody else can answer, that's okay as well. My first question is around the Go Scare program. We know that there's been many organizations that have been taking part in this important work of cleaning up our oceans. We know that there's been a lot of success as a result of this. I don't need the information around what that looks like, but the concern is now that we have cuts. And I'm hearing that there's an international conference that's coming up in February that's likely going to talk about how great the program is, but how great is, how much can be celebrated when the funding is now cut? This means that the people who are doing the work are going to be out of jobs. They're going to move into other areas. The costs are going to double. So when it starts up again, if it starts up again with funding, there's going to be more damage. There's going to be more implications. And so I just don't understand the logic behind cutting this vital program. And I'm wondering if you can share what the plan is here other than everybody gathering to pat themselves in the back at this conference in February.
The program wasn't cut. The program was a sort of a certain period of time. It was so that the program kind of reached its natural end. But the issue of ghost gear and the impact of gear on ecosystems and marine mammals and so on, there's a much broader body of work on that beyond just retrieving ghost gear. There is whale-safe gear, as an example, whale-safe gear strategies that we're working on, and in fact we have some pilots right now on in LFA 36, 38, 38B on a different type of gear to minimize impacts on whales. So there's lots of different pieces that we are engaged on, and that a session in February that you're referring to is around whale-safe gear.
I appreciate that, Deputy Minister, and recognize, and I know we've talked about as a committee the importance of the different types of gear to ensure that it's whale safe, but I'm hearing directly from organizations who have fully participated in ghost gear cleanup, have had much success in doing so, and now I'm being told that that funding has been cut. Can you explain why these organizations are no longer getting funding to clean up the ghost gear, and perhaps some rationale as to how this is actually a cost savings? It's going to cost us more money in the long term.
As I said at the start, it was a time limited program. Like it was an initiative, if you will, and it reached we reached the end of that initiative, but we still carry on much work with respect to gear management of gear to minimize impacts.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. My next question, if I can be honest, I didn't feel like I got a straight answer from the Minister. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt that there was some translation issues that we were having during the time, but I thought I would ask you for some clarification around the European green crab. We know that these European green crabs are recognized to be one of the world's most destructive invasive species. We know that there was funding through the BC SHRIF funding, which is joint federal and provincial funding. And my question is, and which is actually a question that's being asked to me by organizations who are involved in this work, will you be directing funding towards maintaining long-term control and early detection programs Canada-wide?
So we do things through different programs. We have like ongoing programs. We have ongoing aquatic invasive species work in the department and contribution programs and support for provinces, for example, various initiatives. The BC SHRIF program is also a time-limited program, and as the Minister said, with the re-election of the BC government, just sort of letting the ground settle there, and there will no doubt be discussions on renewal of BC SHRIF. So that is another avenue, for example, for dealing with aquatic invasive species.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. I just want to highlight what I was pointing to before. Coastal Restoration Society has cleaned up 780,000 European green crabs since November 2021 in Howsett, Tlaloquit, and Souk waters. It's an incredible number, and I'm just imagining how quickly they will reproduce and create so many more. So I hope that organizations like the Coastal Restoration Society get the answers they need and the funding required to be able to maintain and keep up this important work that they are doing in our marine ecosystems. In the last minute that I have here, I'm going to point out my colleague MP, the MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, had brought forward an order paper question, and he received a response on October the 25th, 2024 that was, for lack of better words, highly inadequate. The question was seeking a detailed breakdown of how the government has spent funds under the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, particularly concerned that insufficient funds are being invested in stock assessment and that the collection of basic escapement data has been declining for decades despite the promises of the Wild Salmon Policy. And so, given these concerns, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move the following motion. that the committee request Fisheries and Oceans Canada provide documentation detailing in the current fiscal year, A, the amount of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative budget allocation that has been allocated and the amount spent for stock assessment, B, under PSSI's conservation and stewardship pillar, the list of specific projects that have reviewed funding commitments and the amounts committed to each project, and D, the total amount of funding that has been dispersed to date since 2021 under each of the strategy's pillars. I bring that forward for us in the hopes that we can agree to have some answers to these very important questions that impact us all.
Mr. Kellaway.
Just a point of order on this. I'm just wondering, does this need to go to notice, or I'm looking at the rules?
We're in committee business as such.
So that can be forged ahead?
We're not in committee business. Yeah.
We're anything on
it's
estimates.
in order.
It's spending and estimates, so.
It's in order.
Okay.
Okay, so
Just check it. Just
I'll
do my due
ask
diligence.
if there,
Do my due diligence.
I'll ask if there's unanimous consent, which would avoid a actual vote count or whatever. So I see thumbs up, our heads nodding
No.
on this side.
No.
No, yep, yes, Mr. Morrissey.
Could we get a written copy of that? So, and then if we could suspend for a moment while we see that, Chair?
It's been sent.
Okay, could we suspend until we
Yep,
get...
we'll suspend for a moment. The clerk to record the vote or count the votes.
I think it's unanimous.
Oh, okay.
Don't need a vote.
I'll ask again, is it unanimous that the motion be approved?
Yeah.
Yep.
Or is it on division?
What about Carolyn?
Okay.
She's okay.
All in favor? Okay, done. That concludes your time, I think. Definitely. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. Commissioner Pelchier, the minister is failing to ensure fisheries law and regulations are being enforced, and it's unclear if non-enforcement is because of a shortage of enforcement capacity. If the minister requested it, would the Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard, be equipped and able to assist with enforcement of laws and regulations of fisheries?
We don't have fisheries officer on board Coast Guard ships right now, but we prioritize the work that needs to be done, and there's a certain number of days for dedicated to CNP, and we do make sure that we deliver those days. And another good example was last summer through the North Pacific Guard, where we deployed a Coast Guard ship to the North Pacific to do some IUU monitoring as well, too, the first time that we've ever done that. So this is the kind of flexibility or the kind of prioritization that we do.
Thank you. Ms. Gibbons, you stated in one of your comments, and I'll quote, they never have to engage if they're in danger. Isn't this a signal to criminals and organized crime that if they threaten DFO, CNP personnel, it will result in them backing off?
Maybe I'll ask Adam to speak to this particular point, but if there is a physical danger that the officers think is going to get out of hand and threaten their personal safety, they do not engage in that situation, and that is when we would go to law enforcement to support.
So I think that's a significant enough answer. Commissioner Pelche, considering the violence that has emerged in the fisheries conflicts caused by the minister's failure to enforce the laws and regulations, would the Coast Guard need to be armed if they assumed a supporting role supporting fisheries enforcement?
We are actually supporting fisheries enforcement. We have 2 ships out of Newfoundland that do NAFO patrols, and there's an armboarding team on board.
But would they need to be armed? Was the question.
If they're going to do armboarding, then the onboarding team needs to be armed. Other than that, to work alongside, whether it's CNP officer or CMP on board our ship, we provide protective equipment such as body armor, but they don't need to be armed.
Okay, thank you. For Mr. Burns, is there a Director General for DFO's Conservation and Protection branch? If so, who would that be?
Yes, there is. The acting Director General, who's been in place for a number of months now, is Anik Chartrand.
Okay, thank you. This is for Mr. O'Day. BC's shrimp fishery is collapsing, unlike our neighbors' shrimp fisheries that are harvesting at record catches and driving strong coastal communities and providing healthy nutrition and protein for their communities. This is the result of DFO's Pacific Shrimp Resource Management, who has heaped 6 precautionary approaches on BC's fisheries with zero consideration of the cumulative effects that these have on British Columbia's. This is costing BC harvesters hundreds of millions annually in lost revenue. This year, DFO required monitoring fees amounting to 43% of the value of the landed catch of BC's shrimp fisheries. This is absolute ludicrous oversight. Mr. O'Day, as a lone witness from DFO policy here, will you initiate an investigation into this matter and provide the committee with a written brief by year's end explaining why DFO is shutting down BC's shrimp fishery?
Thank you for the question. So I would clarify that it's not the role of policy to investigate. However, if a written response to the question is requested, we can provide one.
Thank you. It's certainly requested, and it seems to be policy that is shutting this fishery down. It's ludicrous that there are so many precautionary principle approaches placed on this fishery when the harvesters themselves can show DFO that there is abundant biomass out there, and yet they get no access to it.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before my question to our honorable witnesses in the room, I just have to go back on the comments of Mr. Perkins and Mr. Small regarding Small Craft Harbor. Can you believe this? Like, my colleague at the table voted against the last budget that include more money for Small Craft Harbor. Now they're begging to have projects in their riding. And I hope fishers are listening to this tonight, because if
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Be no more.
Point of order.
1 second, Mr. Cormier. We have a point of order.
Can we confirm where Mr. Cormier is? I'm not sure whether it you know, to some it looks like it could be a CBSA holding cell.
Chair, what's the point of order?
What's this comment, Mr. Chair? What's the point of this comment?
Yeah, it's dealt with, Mr. Cormier. Continue, please.
So I hope fishers in their respective riding knows that they vote against that budget. There will be no more money for Small Craft Harbor if they took office. And I have a suggestion for those both members. Do like their colleagues did for housing project. Write a letter to Mr.
Perkins, will you please stop talking out loud? Keep it to yourself under your breath, something. Please.
Mr. Chair, if he would be relevant.
Yes, it's relevant. It's relevant, Mr. Chair.
Continue, Mr. Cormier.
Did for housing project. write a letter to Minister Leboutier and ask for support for your project? Oh, but no way. They can, because they will be punished by their leader, Mr. Poliev. So on that, Mr. Chair, let's start with some question. Mr. Pelletier, just want to get some clarification regarding the Coast Guard and the money that you need. Vous savez, Monsieur Pelletier, qu'on a besoin.
Mr. Pelletier, you know, we need you to make sure that we can have an early fishery in these areas before the whales get there. And if that doesn't happen, and I don't want to alarm our associations, but what would it mean if you didn't have this kind of supplementary funding? Would it compromise any of your activities? Can you please comment on what that would mean for you if the funding did not come through in time? Well, I'll perhaps keep my remarks to the fuels. I mean, we need icebreakers, and they are the ones that use the most fuel. And icebreaking it takes a considerable amount of fuel. If we don't have that funding, then we won't have funding to put diesel in the vessels. And what would happen in terms of your staff? Would your staff be able to be paid, or would you have the staff that you need? Well, we'll need new staff because the new vessels will require new talent and new skills. So the new funding would allow us to recruit that talent and to allow us to start recruiting that talent today before the new vessels come in. Thank you very much, Mr. Pelletier. I believe that the associations are very pleased with all the efforts that have been deployed over the past several years, and let's hope that things go well this year and then that supplementary funding is allocated. Ms. Gibbons. There is funding for small craft harbors. We're very pleased to see that that supplementary funding is being proposed, but there's something that isn't clear about the allocation of that funding. It takes a lot of time for some projects to get off the ground. I've asked the question of Mr. Burns the last time he came to before the committee. So I'd just like to ask this. What exactly happens? Let's say something has to be dug within a riding X. And let's say the funding comes through from DFO. Who then authorizes the digging to begin? So could you just explain the process? Because some of these things seem to take a long time, and some of these projects don't move ahead quickly enough. And what that does is compromise the safety of our fishers. So could you just give us an overview of what happens? And please, could you give us the details that we need quickly? Thank you for the question. There's a lot of planning involved at various levels. So there can be general overall planning. For example, that one harbor needs to be completely redone. In another case, there might be a wharf, for example, that has to be repaired. So when we know what kind of funding we're going to get, then there's a timeline, and that timeline involves decisions and priorities being set. But what we have to do is look at what is available. What's available, for example, in terms of studies that have been done. We need to know that the engineers are ready to tell us exactly what needs to be done. Yes, but Ms. Gibbons, some permits have already been provided for digging of channels, for example, and it seems to take a lot of money and a lot of time. And I'm not blaming you, but sometimes the problem seems to be
We'll now go to Madam Deputy. 5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. I'm sorry I didn't put my timer on here, so please just point out when I'm running out of time. I want to ask you a question about the Indigenous communities. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested in reconciliation, truth and reconciliation. And there's a lot of money that has been invested in Indigenous issues. And sometimes one can wonder if that money is actually getting to Indigenous people, because here we listen to many witnesses, and oftentimes these witnesses say they don't have the means, they don't have the resources they need, or that they're not drawing on their skills, their knowledge on the ground. Sometimes I get the impression that money won't necessarily solve this nation-to-nation issue. It's not millions of dollars that will necessarily make this right. There's a way of working, and perhaps that way of working needs to be looked at. Within your framework, you have scientists, but could sociologists perhaps be taking a look at the relationships between Indigenous communities and government departments? Is that something that could be part of your budget so that you can really zero in on the factors that are important so that there can be a better use, actually, of the money invested? Thank you for the question. The recipients of funding for Indigenous communities are the Indigenous communities, so nobody else receives it. Now, in terms of the way of working together, sometimes funding will be provided, for example, for a fishing vessel. In other cases, it might be for working together. And in those cases, these communities are requesting that funding so that they can improve their capacity to work with the department. For example, let's say they want to be able to apply Indigenous knowledge. Well, they need funding to be able to pay people from their communities to do that kind of work in collaboration with the department, for example, for fishery management or for the study of marine ecosystems. And this is often termed or falls under capacity funding, and communities request that. And in our discussions with these communities, we try to understand what they are interested in, in terms of ecosystem conservation. So we try to meet them where they are at so that we can match their interests rather than just have these overall fixed objectives.
For Ms. Barron, 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you again for your answers and for being here. My next question, on March the 7th, I had sent a letter to Minister Leboutillier. I keep forgetting when we can say last names and when we can't. And I was, in this letter, I was reaffirming some of the concerns of the BC Wildlife Federation, in particular around whirling disease. We know that there has been several confirmed cases in BC lakes and waterways, and the BCWF at this time was urging a request for information on the department's plans to eradicate this parasite, and they're warning that that critical fish species are threatened and endangered, would be completely wiped out if this problem was left unchecked. I received a response that basically redirected me by the minister to, at that time, Minister Holland. And I guess the bigger question is this still a problem that we should be worried about? Is what's being done to ensure that we don't? I've seen the impacts of this disease, and it's not very nice to look at. And so, what's being done to ensure, through the budget that we're talking about today, to ensure that we don't see this being spread?
I would just answer in general that we work with the CFIA, we work with the provinces on helping to manage disease, and DFO plays a part. We're not always a central player, but I cannot give you a detailed brief on whirling disease today. So happy to come back with more detail.
Can you give any updates around the continued shipbreaking that's happening in Union Bay that's polluting the surrounding marine ecosystem? anything happening with that, any funding being allocated to ensure that we have environmentally sound shipbreaking happening with proper procedures in place to protect our environment?
So this is an activity that touches a bunch of different departments and the province as well. And DFO plays a role, the Coast Guard plays a role, but the core role of that activity is really, because most of it is on land, is with the province. There was a symposium, I'm not sure the exact name of the event, but there was an event about a month, 6 weeks ago, where we did have federal officials from Transport, ECCC, Environment, Climate Change, and DFO participate, sort of an all-day session with community members expressing their views on that activity, and we had officials there to answer questions.
Ms. Barron, your time is up, a little bit over. That concludes our rounds of questioning. I want to thank Mr. Burns, Mr. O'Day, Mr. Goodyear, Mr. Palache, and Madam Gibbons. We got votes to do on the supplementary estimates. We only have until 6:32.
Point of order.
Yeah, you can raise a point of order, yeah.
No, that wasn't in the agenda.
Extension of
We don't have it.
Health services?
We don't have it. 6:32 is all we can get. And we got 3 votes to do.
Yeah, first of all, you didn't check. So when that member requests under the new rules, you're supposed to check to see if we can get additional resources. Secondly,
I asked that at the beginning before I even
no,
started the meeting.
The new rule is a member
Before I
can
even
ask
asked the meeting.
a member can ask any time in the meeting for additional
Well, the
resources.
answer is no.
No, you don't get to rule on that. The clerk is responsible for asking.
The clerk has informed me when I came in today that we had to finish at 6:32.
And secondly, the vote isn't
Period.
listed on here, so we have 10 minutes left to continue questioning.
No, you don't.
It's not on the agenda.
No, you don't.
Yeah, we do.
Look, right here, supplementary estimates.
I challenge the chair on that rule.
You can challenge who you like.
You have to conduct the vote.
We're doing a vote first.
Just Chair, but a point of order, because I'm not sure what we're voting on, and I'm not sure what the chair got challenged on.
I got challenged on moving to the votes, I guess, for the supplementary estimates.
Can I?
So Mr. Perkins don't want us to vote on them.
No, I want us to finish what the agenda says.
But we only got till 6:32.
I just like to finish what the agenda says.
Madam Clerk, how much time we got?
And Madam Clerk, did you check with the central authorities on time? No, you didn't. It is your responsibility. Under the rules of the House, the clerk has to check if we can get additional resources. You don't get to rule on that. It's up to the clerk.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order, Mr. Perkins, deciding what.
Well, you'd know it.
Meeting. I have a point of order on the floor, Mr. Chair.
How do you know he's not in Ottawa? Somebody complained about his back picture there before. He might be in his office. He could be in his hotel room.
So Mr. Perkins and Mr. Small were in their car sometime for vote. So, Mr. Chair, you're the chair.
You cannot lie, Serge. I've never voted from my car. I know Liberals like to do it regularly. I've never done that. I go to the House to vote. You should try it sometime.
Point of order. Could I raise point of order?
Yeah, point of order and point of order.
Thank you. The chair called the agenda of the meeting. My point of order, we had witness brought in to discuss important issues. I would have liked to have got to my question round, but I respect the agenda set forward by the chair. So can we have some order and get to that particular stage?
Okay. Okay. We have the vote on the challenge first.
Okay.
So if you vote to sustain the decision of the chair, we go to votes. If you vote nay, you defeat the challenge and we continue questioning of the witnesses. Mr. Cormier.
So I vote to sustain the chair decision.
Point of order. I don't have the full information to be able to actually make a sound vote here, but.
You want an explanation?
Well,
from the chair or the clerk?
So there was a challenge to continue questioning of the witnesses?
No, I know, but it's hard to know whether to sustain the challenge or not if I don't have the full information around actual process. That's the concern.
Okay, so to sustain the decision of the chair, you vote yea, so.
I understand that.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I'm not trying to be short with you. Yeah.
Mr. Callaway.
Thank you. I don't, look, I'm not trying to be obstructionist at all. I kind of want to know, we need a vote. Let's do that. But before that, can we just, because there was a lot of voices going back and forth, and maybe it's this 54-year-old brain, but I'd like to hear, like, from the chair, like, the rationale from you.
The vote has been called. So.
Okay, but the problem is that you guys are talking over each other constantly, and some of us are trying to follow it. So the vote may be called, but there's got to be some civility here, guys.
But the clerk just explained to Ms. Barron.
I'm on the same point of Lisa Marie. That's ridiculous.
Ms. Koutrakias.
It's ridiculous.
That's what I'm going to do.
I vote to sustain the chair.
Mr. Hardy.
I vote to sustain the chair.
Mr. Kellaway.
I vote to sustain the chair.
Mr. Morrissey.
Sustain.
Mr. Arnold. Mr. Bragdon. Mr. Perkins.
Against the chair's ruling.
Mr. Small.
Challenge.
Madame Desbiens.
Tiens, je ne suis pas à la maternelle.
Ms. Barron.
I abstain.
5 yeas, 4 nays. So the decision is sustained.
Bingo.
Point of order?
We're going to the votes first, and then
Well, you
I'll
hadn't
get
called the vote, so just a quick point of order. So has the clerk received a response yet or whether we get additional resources?
That's what I'm sending right now because I had to do the votes. But I'm doing it right now.
Yes, Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The notice of meeting that came out was from 4:30 to 5:30 with the minister, from 5:30 to 6:30, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, 5:30 to 6:30. You cut this meeting off at 6:20. You cut the meeting off at 6:20.
Because we have to do I read this out at the beginning. I said we have to do supplementary estimate votes after it. No, we can't. We're doing it this evening.
Only because you wanted to cut it off.
We'll see.
But the chair's agenda was sustained by, and decision was sustained by the committee. So let's move to the agenda.
So in all, 3 votes, we didn't hear any back yet? Okay. 3 votes in all. Unless any objection, I will seek unanimous consent of the committee to group the votes together for a decision. Is there unanimous consent to proceed this way? No. Okay. We'll go by each vote then. Now, let's see. I will now put the question on each vote separately. Shall vote 1B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans carry or not carry? Or
Chair, point of order. Could you tell us what the implications are, what the monetary amount is for? Do you have a brief?
I don't have any amount.
No. Sorry. What the title is? What is the area that we're voting on? Of the department to
Supplementary estimates.
Yes, but do you have a
supplementary estimates B 2024-25?
The deputy could give us that. What is that money for? I want to know before we are voting for it or against it. So if you could. Give me the general.
We're just looking for the
Yeah, I want to know what money, so that we'll know who's voting against it and who's voting for it. Good.
That information.
say the meeting is over.
No, actually, it's not.
It is 6:32. You said the meeting only goes to 6:32, so it's over.
But you asked the clerk to see if there was additional time.
And she
found
hasn't
additional
responded
time.
before 6:32.
What?
She hasn't responded before 6:32, so I called
Yes,
the
she
meeting
did.
over. No, she didn't.
She told me before I took
No,
the
she
mic.
didn't.
Yes, she did. She showed it
She
to
might
me.
have told you, didn't tell me.
Well,
Didn't tell the committee.
you should be listening instead of talking.
You didn't say anything on this mic, just because you have private conversations at 6:32.
Chair, on a point of order, if we have a motion to adjourn, we don't agree, so we'll have to go to a vote, right?
Yeah, okay.
So is Mr. Perkins moving that we adjourn before the answers, before the questions are answered and the department gets the money that everybody was looking at this table was looking for and asking for? I just want to know.
Yeah, motion to adjourn.
Okay. I don't agree with it, so
All right. Oh, the clerk will do the.
I record a vote. I want to hear from the department and vote on money that everybody was looking for.
Monsieur Cormier.
No.
Ms. Koutrakis.
No.
Mr. Hardy.
No.
Mr. Kellaway.
No.
Mr. Morrissey.
No.
Mr. Arnold.
Yes.
Mr. Bragdon.
Yes.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Small.
Yes.
Madame Desbiens.
No.
Ms. Barron.
To adjourn, no.
There you go. Okay.
So how much time, extra time do we have?
I'll let you know when I'm finished. How's
Good.
that?
Let me know.
Shall
No, no.
vote 1B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans carry in the amount of $90,469,389. Okay. Madam Clerk.
Money it needs.
Monsieur Cormier.
Oui.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Yes.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Oui.
Mr. Morrissey.
Of course.
Mr. Arnold.
No.
Oh.
Mr. Bragdon.
No.
Mr. Perkins.
Confidence motion, so no.
Mr. Small.
Vote non-confidence.
Oh.
Madame Desbiens.
Well, that's not a vote. That's either for or against, Mr.
No.
Small, please. Got nothing to do with confidence.
Madame Desbiens. Ms. Barron.
Yes.
We voted against your massive overspending.
And you were looking for money for your riding.
Let's go to number 2.
Good.
Shall vote 5B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans carry in the amount of $109,070,076. Record a vote.
Monsieur Cormier.
Bien sûr, oui.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Oui.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
Yes.
Mr. Morrissey.
Yes.
Mr. Arnold.
No.
Mr. Bragdon.
No.
Mr. Perkins.
These Liberals have already overspent too much. No.
Mr. Small.
Considering we can't get a management plan delivered on time with the money that they had and 3 times more than in 2014, I vote against.
Madame Desbiens. Ms. Barron.
Yes.
Aha. Vote 5B passes. Shall vote 10B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans carry in the amount of $331,601,775. Okay.
Monsieur Cormier.
Je vote toujours oui pour plus d'argent pour les ports du bateau.
I always vote for more money for small craft harbors.
Yes.
Mr. Hardy.
Yes.
Mr. Kellaway.
I support Fishers. Yes.
Mr. Morrissey.
Yes.
Mr. Arnold.
I can't support the waste. No.
Mr. Bragdon.
No.
Mr. Perkins.
Seeing as the Liberals refuse to enforce the fisheries law in Nova Scotia, no.
Mr. Small.
Since Liberals have turned the Small Craft Harbors program into their very own slush fund, I vote no.
Madame Desbiens.
J'espère qu'il y aura quelque chose pour le Québec.
I hope there'll be something for Quebec, yes.
Ms. Barron?
Yes.
Okay. Motion carried. Shall I report the supplementary estimates B 2024-25 votes 1B, 5B and 10B under Department of Fisheries and Oceans to the House? What? On division? Okay. Done. Next Monday, we will resume our study of the review of the Fisheries Act. Just for anyone.
You should ask.
We have an extra hour, apparently, so we're going to continue to sit.
Is the committee in agreement to adjourn the meeting?
No, there isn't. No, there isn't, because we got an extra hour, according to you, Mr. Chair. So
No, I
ask
said we
officials
needed
to
time enough for this, not for the
No,
extra
no,
hour.
we've got, that's not my motion and my, sorry, Mr. Chair, point of order. Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of
Meeting
order.
adjourned.
You don't get the right to rule.
Yes, I do. I do.
No, you don't.
Yes,